Good morning and welcome back to Almus Market Mornings. A very eventful night, I must say. We kicked off the 2026 FIFA World Cup, saw SpaceX raise $75 billion in what is being described as the biggest IPO in history. And most importantly for markets, President Trump signaled that Iran deal is effectively closed after canceling planned strikes on Iran. The dollar weakened on the back of this news, which helped global equities, major currency crosses, and especially precious metals stage a strong rebound. And after weeks of geopolitical tension and market nerves, it feels like we're heading into the weekend on a much more positive note. Good morning, Jayaram sir. With the sentiment turning sharply positive tonight, do you think this is the start of a more sustained risk-on move, or are the markets still vulnerable to another headline-driven reversal?
We have fingers crossed, Ishan, because that's not the way things have been panning out. Yes, we have been bouts of optimism and pessimism going into the markets, every weekend. And so this week, maybe we are going to end on a positive note with also the SpaceX IPO making a debut today in the market. It will be listed today in the markets, and it has had a best setting because the Nasdaq rallied by nearly 3%, Dow rallied by nearly 2%, and so the sentiment is upbeat. So maybe at least till the weekend, Trump may not make any damaging comments. However, yesterday, for most of the day, we were in a very deeply risk of environment because Trump said that he would be hitting Iran very hard yesterday night, and they will be taking over the Karg Island and other oil infrastructure points. As much negative statements you can get was there yesterday, and then of course the Iranian members also said that they are. So, the US is responsible for making the situation worse. But with the mid New York session, everything's changed. And, he said, Trump said that he is going to, he's canceling the planned attacks on Iran. And in fact, he said that a deal would be signed with Iran in the next few days. And this is completely opposite to what he said earlier in the day. That's why market is not taking it with the full force of, believing it. But of course, we'll wait and see what happens. The reaction for this from Iranian side has also been quite guarded. They say that they have not yet reached a final decision on an agreement. That is what the Iranian ministry spokesperson says. Another Fars news agency said that Tehran is likely to approve the agreement, although it has yet to give a formal response. So there are different kind of responses from Iran as also. Yes, now we will take this recovery in the market with both hands because we had seen, particularly on the commodities, they had slumped to very low levels yesterday. Gold hit as low as 4020 yesterday, almost breaking 4,000, and then silver also broke the previous low of 64 and held on there. And then the equities had seen a big slump day before yesterday. And it may not be exactly a coincidence that Trump's benign statements have come just a day ahead of the SpaceX debut on the Nasdaq. So as you said, the 75 billion has been raised in the IPO, and the company is valued at 1.77 trillion. Markets hope that there will be a strong debut by the market, and that will give a huge boost to the rest of the risk markets as well. But actually, these war statements and developments have actually shadowed the other important events yesterday, particularly the PPI number from US, the wholesale inflation, again rose at the highest pace, second fastest pace on record at 1.1% monthly inflation. That was what was seen in May, and the even the year-on-year inflation came at 6.5%. And last month it was at 6%. Only saving grace was the core inflation, which came lower than expected at 0.4%. Of course, last month it was at 1%. And the year-on-year inflation on the core was at 4.9% versus 5.4%. Again, since the market was in a sober mood, these data were taken in a very positive way. That's why the yields came off, and then the stocks rallied along with the news from the war front. But then, even if you ignore what was expected versus what was the real number, they are at on a standalone basis. They are at a very high level, and it cannot be brushed aside by Fed. And although wholesale inflation is not one something which will determine the policy, but the expectation is that eventually it will flow down to the retail prices, and that is when the Fed will get more concerned. We'll have to wait and see. Of course, we also have to see the monthly PCE number, which will be coming later in the month. Then we had, of course, the ECB rate decision yesterday, and ECB hiked rate by 0.24%. Very well expected, of course. But then interest was on what they are going to do next, and there they were non-committal, and they are probably more concerned about the impact on growth of the eurozone, because the growth picture there has not been very encouraging, and a series of rate hikes would further dampen the growth picture there. So the debate is whether they will again hike in July, but most of the consensus says that it's not going to be July, and it's only in the following month that they would be hiking the rate. So we now had one of the major central banks hiking rate. Canada, of course, kept the rate unchanged. And now we have the next week's Fed meeting, BOJ, and then Bank of England, three major policy decisions. BOJ, of course, the Bank of Japan expected to hike rate. I'm wondering whether instead of 0.25, that is well discounted by the market, whether they will do a 0.5% hike. Very unlikely, considering what Japan normally, under delivers. But then, considering their fight against the weakness in yen, that may not be totally out of sync. Then, of course, Bank of England will hold on because the growth picture is not very encouraging there. So that is the picture. And of course, the forecast from ECB on inflation was higher, and the growth picture was downgraded. And so it actually, you're seeing some sort of a stagflationary situation that is being seen. Now, the other important news item was the World Bank growth projection for 2026. It has cut the global growth to 2.5% from 2.6% that was given earlier in January. India, of course, has been maintained at 6.6%, the fastest growing still, although Jan forecast was at 6.7%. US is expected to grow at only 1.4% versus 2.2% earlier. So in broadly, the growth projections have been lowered. Oil prices are also projected to average about 94 per barrel in 2026, according to the World Bank. And so they are quite dovish on the developing economies facing a huge amount of problems because of the Middle East war. India, of course, expected to maintain the fastest growing economy tag. So that's although we are not immune to oil prices and weaker global demand, as well as the reduced capital flows. So all in all, dollar had a good day. And currencies had a good day. Dollar gave up most of the gains. Once again, failing near 100.50. That is significant because we have a number of failures around 100.50 in the dollar index. So euro has recovered to 1.1570 from 1.1500 that was seen after the ECB meeting. Dollar yen also came off from 160.60 to 160.00. So there's a bit of a sell-off in the dollar as well. The recovery in metals have been very staggering. Gold has recovered back to 4,200 from almost 4,000. That's a $200 recovery. And silver from around 61.5, it's come to 67.5. Once again, it's about a 10% rally in the silver prices from the lows that was seen yesterday. So that market has now seen some breather after having been under continuous bear pressure. For the rupee, yesterday we saw the rupee weaken towards the higher end of the range. In fact, broke the higher end of the range at 95.70 with consistent demand hitting the market. This was also backed by not so good news from the war front, and market ended at its highest. Of course, since we have had the good news from the Trump, markets have seen dollar go down to 95.20 from the high seen in New York. So we are still sticking on to the broad range between 95 and 96. And what would be interesting to see is whether we see resurfacing of a good demand at these lower levels to take the market higher once again. But definitely a strong wall is being built below 96. And to break that, of course, you need some very bad news, or you need some very big demand to hit the market, which the RBI will not meet with its supply. So very interesting situation for rupee, even as optimism builds for record inflows from FCNRB scheme, as well as other measures that the government has been taking over. Yes, Ishan, we go into the weekend with some amount of optimism. Hope it stays till Monday morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayaram. So, and just to summarize, the SpaceX IPO will make a debut today in the US markets, but with an upbeat sentiment in the US as well. We started yesterday on a negative note with respect to the war, but that completely took a U-turn at night as Trump said that he's canceling the plans attacked on Iran and the deal may be signed in the next few days. Seems very contradictory as the stance changes every other day, but investors stay cautious for the same. And we saw commodities after touching to a very, very low level over the last couple of days, showed a sharp rebound on this news along with equities as well. But seems fishy that the sentiment was put across just before the SpaceX IPO today. And the ECB as expected, hiked 0.25%, but focus was what they would do next, which did not seem very concrete in their statements. Now seen as one of the major central banks hiking rates first. So let's see next week as to whether the other central banks will follow. And as to dollar rupee, we saw it break the higher end of the range at 95.70 yesterday, but still broadly remaining in the 95 to 96 rupee level. And a strong wall is being standing at 96. So we will see whether that breaks in the recent times with the RBI really present in the markets. Thank you all so much for listening. Have a great weekend, and we'll catch up on Monday with the fresh round of updates.